Saleh, who will be talking with us about technology and global citizenship. Abdullah?
Thank you, Dr. Saleh. Thank you, everybody, for coming here and away, I guess, on watching the videos. I just want to start a little bit by saying who I am and what I do, just to put some things in perspective. I'm a general surgery resident. You just want me to stick at the podium?
Yeah.
I'm a general surgery resident here at the U of A in my second year, hence the scrub. Sorry, I just came from the OR. And I do a bunch of development work overseas and have been doing that for a few years. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get on with it, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about where I was born and how I ended up in Canada, because I think that's a bit relevant considering the whole global citizenship business. So I was actually born in Iraq, and that was in '84. It was right in the middle of the Iraq-Iran war, and we left and moved to France and lived there for about 7 years, and sort of experienced the French culture and grew up as French children, but also experienced the side of the French culture that includes the racism and the discrimination as well. And so then when my dad's master's and PhD was done, we moved back to Iraq, and that was after the first Gulf War. And so we lived in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, under all that oppression. And then in about 1996, we escaped from Iraq because the situation was getting so dangerous that we had to leave. My dad left first, and then we followed him and ended up in Malaysia. And we lived in Kuala Lumpur for about 4 years. And Kuala Lumpur is, I don't know if any of you have been, but it's a very multicultural place, and sort of three cultures meet. So you have the Malay people, the Chinese people, and the Indian people. And they sort of have managed to find some sort of a way to live harmoniously together. And in about 2000, we immigrated to Canada because, one, we needed a place to stay. I mean, being Iraqi is a risk factor for a lot of things. And we ended up coming here in 2000. I was in Calgary. I did my undergrad, then did medical school here in Edmonton, and now I'm doing residency. So in about 2006, I started doing development work, and I went to South America. I went to Ecuador and worked in a pediatric hospital initially, and then subsequently went and this next summer investigated human trafficking and slavery in Ecuador in particular as an example country. So that work was pretty enlightening because, I mean, in my mind, I was doing the basic volunteering in a hospital initially, and then the second time it was more, let's sort of look at slavery and what that really meant, and then how to prevent human trafficking in South America. And I thought that you have to rescue people, and that's sort of how I could be a global citizen. That I would sort of put my my influence out there by going and trying to make a change in understanding human trafficking, understanding slavery, and what makes slavery such a common problem, even though it's not very well publicized. But then I realized pretty quickly that to be a global citizen, you have to understand your limitations and the harm that you can do. I mean, now as a physician, the medical community probably won't say that they're helping somebody, but it's really the priority is to do no harm first, and then to move beyond that. So subsequently, I ended up getting into medical school, and we developed our understanding anyway of what was an important aspect of what I later on, I guess, came to say global citizenship was. And we thought we should address the basic determinants of health, sort of the initial main fundamental issues that lead to vulnerable populations, that lead to issues like slavery. So we developed technology for water filtration, ended up over the years building a factory in Western Kenya, and then ended up founding an organization, and now we do a lot of development work. So the whole idea of technology and global citizenship has been sort of, I guess, I find myself in the middle, and I find myself struggling with what both of these mean individually, let alone together. So for this talk, I thought maybe we could start with initially just the terminology and maybe just brainstorming what some of these terms like technology and global citizenship is. And then talk a little bit about this idea of globalization that is pretty prevalent nowadays. And then something that I touched on just earlier, rights and responsibilities of a global citizen. I wanted to touch a little bit on technology and concepts of E-Democracy. And so some of the issues and what that probably might mean as we move more and more towards this idea of available technology that increase communication and increase the voice of these vulnerable populations as well as our voices. Which probably, I think, as people's voices emerge, their identity emerges and is probably shaped by these voices and what that entails. I'll talk about Kmri, and that's the Kibera Medical Record Initiative, and that's one of the projects that I'm working on. And I think it helps, especially in light of recent events, probably outline why technology and citizenship is important. Then we'll touch a little bit, and I think Dr. Saleh had sent some articles out and made some available readings. So, global citizenship. I mean, I don't think there's really a passport that says you are a global citizen. But in this day and age of globalization, which it seems to at least be thought of as increased unification of the world. But, I mean, it's increased unification in one sense, as in we have access to each other, but is it an increased equalization of the world? And potentially that's where the fundamental problem really lies, that maybe we're just polarizing the world and just knowing more about it. So the next point is this shrinking world. As we get more and more technologically advanced, we get more and more savvy, and we know more about the world just feels like it's getting smaller. But at the same time, we're moving faster and faster and outstripping what we're able to do. So through communication, trade, immigration, transportation, technology, these are the main really pillars that are unifying this world. Immigration being probably one of the most difficult to really understand, and I want to include that to also talk about trafficking and things like that. And can I participate, or can I get people's voices too? So I mean, what do you guys think? Is it all positive? Do you guys think globalization is all positive? No? Are there some issues with it? What are some issues with it?
Well, you have this anti-globalization force worldwide that goes and protests everything that has to do with globalization. They're probably protesting specific things that they associated with it, like harm to the environment, for instance. But it's quite a phenomenon that the word globalization is a very inflammatory word to some people. And one can think that if you handle the future right, that will no longer be the case. That people will realize that globalization can occur without harming the environment, without impairing human rights. But at the moment, there are people opposed to globalization because of the things that it's associated with, I guess.
But you were going to say something.
Yeah, well, I think you risk losing diversity, which may end up being a very valuable thing.
One might suggest that globalization itself is an American word, and it says to a lot of people, we want, as Americans, access to the rest of the world's markets. We don't necessarily want to open our markets to the rest of the world. So it's very much slanted towards benefit to the American way of life. For kind of people who don't believe that that's the be-all and end-all of existence, it may not be a positive thing. I think that countries should be expected to make decisions in their own best interest. The the negative of that, of course, is folly.
I think you hit on a lot of the main points that I wanted to address. I put up westernization up there because, I mean, we say globalization as if it's, both sides have an equal chance that one day we might see, the way of the samurai sort of being adopted by another country or another culture. But really it seems like the Western culture is the predominant force, and the world just wants to be what the Western world is. And the Western world wants to be just ever expanding. And you hit on these points of trade and in investment, and what the US or the Western powers, maybe if we want to say more than just the US. So Noam Chomsky actually talks a lot about that, and I don't know if anybody here reads a lot of Chomsky. I'm seeing heads nodding. Yeah. So I mean, really, this whole idea of free trade agreements is really a misnomer, and that the globalization word is a propaganda tool. That we say globalization because we don't want to say that it's investment, that it's free investment agreements or fair investment agreements. And so the free trade sort of involves, or at least implies, a certain bilateral communication or bilateral benefit, and maybe that's not really the case. And I think that's what Chomsky usually tries to refer to. So you were nodding your head. Did you want to add something to that? No? More head nodding. And all right. So let's move along to terminology. What is global citizenship? Who wants to venture a guess or some ideas on it? Anybody?
It's the idea that by being a human being, you have the certain rights of citizenship as if it were that of a nation, but in the whole world, something like that.
And so, I mean, it's a fairly recently coined word. It wasn't in the literature before, maybe 5, maximum 10 years ago that it made its first appearance. But, okay, so the rights that we can, almost as individuals, not be beyond our national borders, that we can take more of an active role in what the world is. But does that only imply social, or does it imply more a bigger sort of gestalt picture to it? I mean, global, I tried to break it down, global, beyond only national borders, the economic, geopolitical, social, and even more, that, just globally affects what we do as individuals. But I had this argument with a human rights lawyer, actually, because I tried to say, we're trying to make a curriculum on global citizenship. And she said that citizenship is a legal term, that we cannot say that there is a global citizenship because citizenship is inherently tied to borders and inherently tied to nationality. And so this whole idea of global citizenship is a misnomer and cannot exist. But more and more the literature is almost prevailing against this technical point. And I think mostly because there are ethical and moral considerations to what that means. So if we are beyond just national citizens, we are also responsible for the welfare of the world. We act not just as we're Albertans, but we're also part of Canada. And in a sense, that's what it is. We're citizens of Canada, but we're also global citizens. I think that's difficult to quantify and to identify. Yes, sir.
So how would we look at anybody from Europe who's a citizen of a nation state, but also formally a citizen of Europe to some degree, aren't they? So it shows that expansion of the term is not unprecedented.
And is that a positive?
Remains to be seen.
Yes, I mean, with their economic problems, maybe that's a sort of a blundering thing. So you touched on rights and responsibilities. I mean, what are the rights of a global citizen?
Wouldn't human rights be a good starting point?
It would be. I think that's that's a very apt way of going about it. Anybody else wants to challenge that, or? Well, what about the responsibilities of global citizens?
We don't like those, we just like the rights.
You just, okay, I'm glad you said that, because, okay, let's look at universities, and, or us, like this generation, that is very much the global citizens, or at least we think we are, and we have the right to go down to Haiti and, wait to volunteer at a clinic and provide help, whatever that means. But what are the responsibilities that come with that? I mean, this is obviously a very limited example, but I mean, we volunteer, and because we have access to transportation, we have access to time, we have the ability to feel that we can affect the world, we communicate with the world fairly readily. So, like you said, there are rights, but we don't take responsibility seriously. Yes, sir?
I think when I was young, I can say that now, I think the idea of having rights tied to responsibilities was accepted. It wasn't even discussed. But I think the separation of rights and responsibilities was brought out by a number of senior politicians in Canada 10, 15 years ago, that rights are inherent, standing by themselves, and aren't legally or any other way tied to responsibilities. And I think this whole issue has to be decided before people make decisions based on the tying of rights and responsibilities together. I don't have an answer for this. I'm just saying that the whole idea of tying rights to responsibilities is not quite as strong as it was 50 years ago.
So apart from these politicians, why would there be such a divergence between these two?
Well, there are human rights. We have rights under the law, and they are not, as far as I can see, legally tied to responsibilities.
Dr. Solis, what do you think?
Well, Canada is a very free country. One of the things is we're free to change our minds, and it affects foreign trained physicians, for instance, who when they enter Canada may say they're not going to practice medicine. The next day they can turn around and decide that they are, and that's legal. Because at the time they entered, they did not intend to practice medicine. The next day they changed their mind. So it's remarkable. Perhaps in some senses we have more freedom here than we should. That's one thing one could argue.
Yeah, I think you're right. That and I think maybe we will see more of the consequences of these freedoms, and maybe lose responsibilities. Yes, sir.
The thing about rights, they're inalienable, and we want them to be. We want them to belong to people no matter what they do. And responsibilities, we may not want to force people. I think responsibilities are better seized when people do so voluntarily. And to point a finger at people and say you have responsibilities that are inalienable just like you have rights might not be the model we're looking for.
So somebody might say, I have the right to smoke, but they don't need to take responsibility for the cost incurred to the
Well,
health.
we would encourage them to assume responsibility willfully and dutifully. We don't want to force them to do that.
And why would we not?
I don't know. It enslaves us all.
So slavery then would it be the absence of rights or decreased rights, or the introduction of responsibilities?
Rights are the most basic thing. We don't want to take them away no matter what. But I think it's hard to argue that responsibilities are exactly the same. I mean, they correlate, but it's better for people to rise up to voluntarily seize responsibilities.
And our rights, so who defines rights? Some people might say that's not right.
I just said the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as fundamental creeds of major religious and ethical systems are good. You have a good sense of them. They're articulated well. I mean, you might want to call, the Americans put it well, life, liberty, and happiness, something like that.
Yeah.
Or pursuit of that.
Okay, well, yes, we talked a little bit about global citizenship, or at least ideas around that. Now comes this whole technology, and I mean, technology is, I mean, some people might be against technology, and some people do live, and they have the right to live that, and maybe they live in communities here in Alberta where they don't want technology, but there might be some disparity in action if they come to a hospital looking for care or things like that. And I think technology becomes a little bit of a driving force towards these rights and responsibilities. And I think for a lot of the world nowadays, technology has become a lifeline for individuals. And I mean, the easiest, sort of most beaten example is the cell phone. I mean, everybody who has, people prefer to have cell phones in the slums over food because that's a lifeline for them, and they can ensure having food and jobs and communication and a social life and exist and have an identity by having this technology, which they never did before. So it sort of entirely flipped their whole rights, I guess, suddenly became apparent with the introduction of technology. So if we extrapolate this as we introduce more and more technologies, what does that mean? And how are these people's lives going to change continuously? We have this whole global north versus south because before it used to be fairly well delineated, and you would go to these places. Now we see these places sort of everywhere, and the intermesh between these two, global north and south, is becoming so entangled that it's hard to sort of break them apart. Anybody has any comments on that? I think technology also helped break barriers that, like we said, bringing a voice to people. And we can talk a little bit about social media and what that has done for individuals like the Arab Spring, for example. What that meant for them to have access to technology and to overcome a system of oppression, some would call it, and probably most would call it, that has existed for about 20, 30 years, and a system that I grew up under. And that what it took to get Saddam Hussein out of power was military intervention and billions, if not trillions of dollars. Whereas a introduction of a social medium that allowed individuals who didn't previously have this medium to vocalize, to create an identity for themselves, did it in a fortnight, in a sense, sort of topple powers just by exerting their global citizenship, in a sense. Because it wasn't just the people in Egypt that heard them, it was the whole world. And that's when things sort of went down south for Mubarak. Now, appropriate technology, I just wanted to touch on that because I think more and more, it's starting to fade as a concept, but I think a lot of people still who practice development, and I talk a lot about it from the development aspect just because that's what I'm a bit familiar with, but we say that an appropriate technology for a resource-limited setting is probably the most basic technology. But I don't think that's really true anymore, because as technology is advancing, we're sort of starting to see the ripple effect of technologies that may not have been deemed appropriate. So a cell phone does not make sense in a slum. Buying credit to fill your airtime so that you can make a phone call when you can't eat or your child has cholera doesn't make sense. But it makes a lot of sense when you see it in practice. And so appropriate technology has been sort of this, backwards technology, simple, very basic, no circuits, nothing. That's good. That's global south sort of technology. Very advanced genomics, very fancy telecommunication stuff. That's for us, global north. But now more and more, like people on these cell phones have access to social media, they communicate with each other, they're more up to speed on news than I am, and it's incredible to see. So I mean, we talked a little bit about this whole concept of identity, and I think that really technology can help create identity. And so, because it does give these people a voice or a presence, maybe not physically, but at least it makes the rest of us aware about what their plight is. I mean, when the representation of people, I think, let's say World Vision, and you see a child suffering on TV, and it's sort of being told to you, is one thing, and it elicits an emotional response, because, and it's, you know, in a way it's sort of, I don't want to use the word, but it's sort of the prostitution of suffering to create awareness. Whereas a social medium through technology, that these people that are on TV are telling you, well, we need this, and this is what we're doing about it, so if you want, come, you can join us. I mean, it has sort of created a different way of looking at people who are vulnerable. We have, I'll talk a little bit about a project we're doing on the Thailand-Burmese border. So I don't know if many of you are familiar with Burma, and Burma has had a military dictatorship for years and years, and they're oppressing their people, and primarily because China funds the Burmese military junta to drive out people from resource-rich lands, because they're building pipelines, they're building hydroelectric plants. So people from Burma escape to Thailand because they share a border. So these people run away and hide out in Thailand. Thailand and Burma have had a very rocky relationship for sort of centuries. And so Thailand refuses to sign the United Nations High Commission for Refugee, the whole document, which means that these people do not exist as legal refugees. They exist illegally in Thailand. And interestingly, Thailand gets their electricity, or Bangkok gets its electricity from Burmese hydroelectric plants that are funded by China. So now you've created this nice little triangle with these vulnerable people in the middle that have no identity. So we've been trying to figure out a way of, to empower these people. And what we're trying right now is whether the use of electronic medical records introduced at clinics where they can come and sort of get seen, because that's what they would do anyway. And then these records create a permanent impression, at least a digital impression, that they exist. And then when you prove that these people exist and their numbers and what they do and that they have families and they get sick and that they die, then suddenly you've created an identity for them. An identity that's a bit hard to dispute on the legal stage. And so we're trying to use electronic medical records in this one particular condition to give these people an identity. While all the benefits of EMR, or electronic medical records, from a medical point of view are very important, but for us we're trying to use a very different way of approaching it. And it's just wanted to show you guys this from what does that really mean, and what does technology really, what can it do for people? There are detriments, but I think that if used judiciously, as Dr. Saleh said, we can probably change the way things are. And that's a fairly fundamental thing to say. The concept of E-Democracy, and it's this whole concept that maybe because everybody's being connected, they can voice their opinions. Sorry, am I running a bit out of time? No. So that because everyone is connected, you can have their voice, and you can have a true democracy with equal representation for everybody. That individuals who could only be heard through their counselor, who then goes to city council, and city council goes to the ledge, and the ledge goes to the government over in Ottawa, and that's the only way we'd hear about them. But now this whole idea that everybody has a phone, everybody can vote, they don't, but they could. it's a new way, I think, of looking at it. It's approaching an ideal, at least what all the Greek philosophers sort of wanted for equal representation and what democracy really meant. So a Delphi process is, are you familiar with a Delphi process? It's sort of a consensus reaching tool where you send out a questionnaire, for example, and I poll all of you and ask you a question, a fairly open-ended question. You send me all of the responses back. I put it together, send it back out to you, and say, is this what you mean? And you send it back to me. And as we go with many rounds of this, we approach consensus. And it's a way of looking at how can we approach a democratic way of choosing beyond majority-minority sort of governance. I talked a little bit about social media and its power, but I think its power is still probably under-recognized in terms of what that means when we share photos of ourselves and when we voice our opinions online, or when we participate in surveys and such. The Arab Spring is a prime example which we've touched on. But are there perils to this? What are some of the perils that you guys can think of?
Well, you have people who were never given any role model leading other human beings, suddenly finding themselves in a leadership position sort of by, default, because there isn't anybody else and somebody needs to lead. And it's exciting, the spontaneity of that, but I suppose there are inherent dangers of such sudden being thrust into leadership. There are going to be mistakes made, whether they're worse than the mistakes being made on purpose by the people that you replaced is an open question. But, in these circumstances, you don't have a way of preparing for the revolution and grooming leaders over many years. You may accidentally have groomed them in some other way, in some other milieu, and now they're leading the country. But it doesn't seem like ideal preparation for leadership to suddenly be thrust into a leadership role.
Anybody else?
Well, just, I don't know if it's relevant or not, but somebody did a nice little study, a very interesting study in the States a couple of years ago, and came out with a suggestion that with all these big multinational corporations, there were very few examples where they could find evidence that was important at all. And there were a couple of obvious examples. Steve Jobs was one, and they gave, the guy who turned Chrysler around a few years ago, Lee Iacocca, and so on. And there's a few. And in their study, and looking at the nature of the CEOs, they came to the conclusion that in most cases, they could almost put any fairly intelligent person up there. And you could perhaps say a very similar thing about some of our leaders. If you look at some of the decisions that have been made in the last 50 years in the Western world, how President Johnson in the States committed hundreds of thousands of troops because he was concerned that his ratings might go down a little bit if he didn't involve the United States more in the Vietnam War. It's just awful the way that you can make a decision like that, but that's what they do, and I'm not sure that we couldn't pluck them out and stick any well-thinking, fairly educated, intelligent person in their spot. That's what's wonderful about democracy. That's why why shoot one of them? Because we got lots more that we can just put in their place.
In Iraq, when we lived there, we sort of only worried about Saddam, and because we knew what the deal was. You don't talk about Saddam or negatively. You sort of go about your life. Yeah, it won't be a very glorious life unless you're with the party. But then when the government was toppled, like you said, people were not ready. They went from complete control to anarchy, and the system unraveled. and the whole thing fell apart. And Iraq now is probably in worse shape, really, than it was before. And so, I mean, maybe these, maybe another point also to bring up is that more and more people are being heard about what they have to say, but maybe less and less relevant things are being said. And it just becomes a volume and sort of how much how many YouTube hits they get, and that's sort of a big point. Yeah.
I think the perils of E-Democracy are same as the perils of good old-fashioned democracy, which is that the majority at times might be misled and for various reasons make bad decisions, and we fear the tyranny of the majority as much as anything else. So hopefully our rights laws protect us against that.
Oh, that's very true. I mean, I think it's a very delicate balance, and I think that there has to be more and more people are very superficially aware of issues and talk about it as if they're very confident. And my dad sort of, he would always tell us growing up, there was 4 types of sort of people. There's people who don't know and know that they don't know, and these are good people to teach. There's people who don't know and think they don't know, or sorry, think they know. Those are the most dangerous, and those are probably people you should avoid, because they have all the confidence in the world and they'll tell you, but they really don't know anything. And there's people that know but don't think they know, and those are people we should encourage. And there's people who know and they think and they know, and those are probably the leaders that we should put at the top and probably should follow. And that's sort of how we were brought up, and then it's like, well, you end up not saying too much because you'll probably get into trouble, even though I'm sure Dr. Bujek will say that I always said more in cardiology than I knew and pretended to get away with it. So, I won't go through too much of the points here. I didn't mean to be too wordy on these next points that will come up, but I just want to talk about another project we're working on, and it's similar to the medical records and what they mean, I think, to individuals. We have a project in Kibera, and are you familiar with Kibera? It's a slum in Kenya, the second largest slum in Africa. IC Change is the organization that I involved in and founded. It's Innovative Canadians for Change, and it's an IC Change project. Kibera is it's a peri-urban or slum area, and it's got about 800,000 to 1.2 million. It's very hard to quantify how many people actually live in Kibera. What we're trying to do in Kibera is to introduce a system of electronic medical records, and our goal for this is threefold. So the first one is, if we network all the clinics that serve a very vulnerable population, we can create a system of referral. So that if I have an x-ray and you have a lab, I can refer my patients to you, and you can refer your patients to me. And it's cost effective, it improves outcomes and patient continuity. But also, we all know that from diagnoses, you need more than one point. You sort of need a trend, you need a past medical history and things relevant like that. But people in the slums and people in vulnerable populations usually are notoriously difficult to flesh out medically and socially. So we've created this network, and so it's to decrease the costs, act as a referral base, and improve continuity. The second layer that we added was we are plotting all these points that are happening or we're picking up from these diseases onto a geographic information system. So that, let's say I run a clinic and 10 people come to me with cholera, but they come with, within 100 or 150 people that I see on a day-to-day basis. And I just see, oh, here's another cholera case. And unless I could see it geographically that they all came from one area, I wouldn't be able to tell that this is really from that one well that has an outbreak that we should probably target before this becomes a huge problem in a particularly population-dense area. The last way, or the last things we're trying to do is, because we have this large population and it's defined and it's sort of in a fairly well-controlled database, you can start to hedge risk and leverage those numbers to provide these people with micro-insurance for health. Now I said PT is outpatient health insurance, because most insurance providers, even for us here, cover medical care when you're in hospital, so that's inpatient care. Whereas outpatient care is neglected, because that's when you go to your family doctor, that's when you go to fill a script, a prescription or something. But the majority of people in slums don't go to hospitals, so they don't have inpatient care. All their costs are from outpatient care. So the system that we're making is an electronic medical record database that functions as a geographic information system and as a health insurance provider. And that's just a very simple technology, which a lot of people have said electronic medical records shouldn't be used in slums because it's an inappropriate technology because you'd need computers, the theft is high, and I argue that the slums are ideal for this because you have a very high population density. So if you want a medical record system, you want people to be very close. You can just walk and survey everybody, or especially if you're mapping them. And population density is very important. Just 2 days ago, there was a pretty big fire in one of the slums in Nairobi, which killed about 120 people because the Kenya pipeline company spilled or dumped oil in one of the pipelines, and the oil went into one of the slums nearby, very close to Kmri, and people, because they're very vulnerable and very poor, went and tried to take the oil that was floating on top and to try to sell it to make revenue for themselves. And then invariably somebody was smoking, a spark happened, and 120 people died. The problem with that is that they don't know who these people are because there's no identity for them. They're slum dwellers that the government doesn't, recognize. And so, again, what we're doing here is to try to create a presence or an identity and to give these people a voice, even in their death. This is an aerial shot of Kibera. You can see that there is some nice neighborhoods around here, but then the slum is sort of this middle, and this is just about half of it. People live in, every one of these little squares is a compound filled with little shacks made of tin roofing walls and just newspapers and cardboard. They have these things called flying toilets, which is what they use to, and it sounds very fancy and technologically advanced, but it's when they use plastic bags for toilets and they chuck it, so they don't know where it lands, and they just chuck it onto roofs, onto other streets around them, and it leads to this whole area sort of being covered with plastic bags that had fecal matter, and children roam and play in this, and that's how their lives are. And so a place like this probably might not be seen as the appropriate place to introduce any kind of high-level intervention, but they are probably the most technologically savvy people I've ever met. They understand the utility of telecommunications better than we ever could, and we are designing systems that rely on that. And they understand it because they don't fill their phones unless it's at the end of the day when they can have somebody else buy the cards for them, and there's a whole system. And they are true survivors in every word, every sense of the word. And maybe these are the global citizens that we're probably focusing on, or trying to bring their voice out in public. That's pretty much all for my talk. I have some special cases that Dr. Saleh had sent out for the readings, and I'll take any questions right now that you might have. Or any comments?
Well, the university has a global citizenship initiative with a planned symposium October the 6th. Do you want to tell us a bit about what the university is doing? And then there's also a course planned for 2012.
So a few years back, or maybe a year and a half ago maybe, I started working with some individuals at the U of A who had created a global citizenship agenda, because they identified this term, and they identified with this term, and that to be global citizens, we can't just be a faculty, and that global citizenship had to be an inter-faculty or a transdisciplinary or trans-faculty initiative. So they went around and tried to link the different faculties at the U of A all together. It was very difficult because even in this day and age, we're very much in silos, and we find it very difficult to cross these silos. And so what ended up happening after about 2 years of them struggling through this is that they just increased awareness for global citizenship in every faculty, but couldn't bring inter-faculty collaboration other than in some cases individually they could find that. So what we tried to do as myself as IC Change and tried to pilot at the Faculty of Medicine was to recruit 8 faculties and to make sure the curriculum was built entirely as a trans faculty or transdisciplinary curriculum. So the curriculum was completed and was ready to be launched for this summer, but we were working in Kenya and we couldn't recruit students in time to take the course. So what we're doing now is to flesh it out some more and to introduce ways to think about concepts in development and how global citizenship is really not a field that exists in silos, but really represents how interconnected we are both globally and locally. Now, luckily our course, because the vision was always to not introduce it just at the U of A, we managed to get people from different universities around the world to try to create their own seeds. And so every university would be a global citizen. And then we would network these global citizens through a software that we're developing. And so the point of this whole thing was to really rely on university students and this youth leadership to step out of these silos and to create this dialogue and to break from the global north, global south. Because wouldn't it be interesting to see what somebody in Ethiopia had to say about First Nation issues that we have here? And that was sort of the goal of this course, because it sort of stopped trying to be inadvertently paternalistic in how we do things by saying, well, we're going to go help them, because maybe they don't need help. So the course hopefully will be offered this summer, and I invite all of you and any of you to participate in developing it and in talking to me about it. Thank you. Let's go to special cases. So as you had sent me these slides, and I guess maybe they should be food for thought or thought over discussion, maybe.
Well, what do you think? I have always been amazed for the past 10 years, let us say, that when the G8 gets together, when various things happen that represent globalization, there are immense protests. And what are the people protesting? I don't think they're not protesting the shrinking of the world. They're not protesting people working together. They're protesting things like damage to the environment, the tremendous empowerment of multinational corporations, and the lack of individual freedom, I guess. Maybe those 3 things. So you could imagine if you could have globalization while maintaining individual freedom, respect for cultures, respect for the environment, and not increasing the power of multinational corporations, then maybe the resistance to globalization would fade, and it would be possible to push that more than it is possible now. What do you think? Why are there such violent protests around the G8 and other things? What are people upset about? Have I identified it in this slide, or is it something else?
I think, and the audience can correct me, but I think there's probably 2 groups in there. There is probably people who are not very well informed and who are protesting because they're it's some sort of like the hippie movement of the 60s, 70s. It's sort of against anti-establishment, and that's the big thing, that the G8 represents the man, and we will fight the man.
Yes.
with all the inherent logic flaws and all that, it's really a maybe lack of better things to do. That's maybe one group. The second group is probably the people who either understand it a little bit better but look at it as a justice thing, and that really it's like having a group of 8 of us in the world, and in a room of 100, and these people are the ones that talk all the time. They're the ones that make all the decisions, and they're like, okay, well, we're going to take your money, we're going to do this, we're going to give you this loan, you're going to do that. And so it's the people who understand it as an injustice, that the globalization initiative is not really a equalizer, it's really just a nice catchphrase to describe what we've always been doing, but now can have a better term for it because of increased communication and increased transparency. The third group is probably the people that do development and sort of see the perils of globalization, or who are from countries which don't want to lose their heritage and their cultures, because having no diversity and all of us being the same, while it's good in some sense, it's probably bad in others. I mean, there's probably reasons why there's so many cultures and so many colors of people and ethnicities.
It's not only bad, it's complete dystopian to think that we would all follow some common. I think that if we learned anything, that's more of a nightmare scenario for most of us who really think about it. We like our diversity, as long as it isn't too diverse.
I think maybe some people object to the hypocrisy of Western countries in that what we think we've learned about our environment and our cultures and so on, and we've made rules and regulations, but we're exporting our things, just as we've outlawed asbestos here, but we're busy exporting it to other countries, and we won't put even a danger sign on the bag saying this might be dangerous. The Americans are exporting cigarettes to the rest of the world and pushing them on children. Well, whereas in the United States, they're sort of increasing regulations to limiting the use of tobacco and so on. And there's all these sorts of things. They can dump rice in Mali, for example, and destroy a whole economy. At the same time, complain about Canadians cutting down trees and sending them to the States, and just the whole hypocrisy of our the way of life, and the whole idea that perhaps we invaded Iraq to get control of the oil fields, which wouldn't be beyond Dick Cheney, I don't think. And maybe people don't like this, the way Western politicians are behaving morally.
When I called my grandma when she was still alive after the invasion in Iraq, and we asked her, is everything okay where she was living, and she said, we said, oh, do you see a lot of American soldiers? She said, no, they're all fortifying the oil fields. That's where everybody was stationed. So, I mean, I think nobody is really anti-globalization. I think that the concepts in theory are really, apart from the negative consequences or maybe the misunderstandings that we will all be the same, people are okay with this increased communication, increased trade, increased benefits from each other, but I think it's in practice where things come up that, people, and especially like you said, it's the hypocrisy of it, that, they meet and said how they're gonna be the champions of the world, but then at the same time, the meeting, while they're talking about all this behind closed doors, is probably not like just talking about these points that they're preaching. The next one was radical global citizenship, balancing government's responsibilities inside and outside its borders. And that probably touches upon what you were mentioning about, inside their borders, they want a healthy population that doesn't have lung cancer, that doesn't have mesothelioma illness for Canada, and a cancer because of asbestos. But outside our borders, really, we want to export things that we make or we extract, and we want to create revenue because we want to keep up our fancy lifestyles.
This term, radical global citizenship, is being used for something specific, which is in the Arab Spring, empowering the local revolutionary by, you know, erasing the record of what they've done on the internet. So their government can't come after them because the record is gone of what they've written, what they've said. And it's fascinating that it is Western technology and often US technology on both sides. The, you know, surveillance in totalitarian governments, almost all the software, the hardware, the mechanisms of listening to phone calls and internet communication, that technology all comes from the US. It's sold by US companies. And so this listening post, this Tripoli listening post that they've recently found, has ads from all these US companies on the wall saying how good they are at this sort of thing and how they can broaden it. You know, if you use keywords to find the people that you want to surveil, you can then broaden it to all their friends and all their, you know, communications where those key